Welcome. I was taking my ramble on the sandwalk when Parslow came and told me you were here. I get few visitors, especially from America. I understand you are interested in my views of my life and work. Well, I hope your chair is comfortable. As Em tells me that with guests, I often don't know when to stop talking. If she enters the room, then quickly leaves, it is a signal I have gone on for too long. I never visited America, although American scientists with whom I corresponded urged me to come. Oh. But I have some familiarity with your wonderful country. I especially hoped to visit Ohio. But although I did not visit, I have some familiarity with your wonderful country. Soon after The Origin was published, the book editor at the New York Times newspaper wrote a review. I still have a copy. Unlike many of the reviews of my book, it was quite complimentary. There are some things that seem utterly incomprehensible, and such may be the case for questions surrounding the origin of life. Indeed, considering the limitations of science, what is there for the wisest but to work in the spirit of the Shakespearean utterance, in nature's book of secrecy, but a little can be read. In respect of the great spinal thought of Mr. Darwin's theory, we are persuaded that the doctrine of progressive modification by natural selection will make a revolution in natural history. Before I begin, I do apologize for anything I say that might offend. At this stage in my life, I have grown weary of the hypocrisy of much of social convention. Some people have a credo that influences their priorities in life. For M, it is faith and family. But for me, it is the truth. I have often said to M, who worries about me in the here and hereafter? No matter what people may say about me, I am content knowing I have sought the truth. Before the publication of The Origin in 1859, it was commonly believed that the world was only 6,000 years old, created by God in about 4,000 BC. Well, actually, precisely at 9 a.m. on Sunday, October 23rd, in the year 4004 BC, according to the calculations of Archbishop Usher. It gives me pause to realize that some people believe this still, and that I accepted this idea without much question when I was much younger. Well, to begin at the beginning. I was born February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury. I grew up in a family of physicians. My paternal grandfather, Erasmus, was a brilliant physician and author. My father, Robert, had one of the largest medical practices outside of London. My older brother, Ras, planned a career in medicine. My mother was a Wedgwood, but she died when I was only 8, and I have few memories of her. Shortly after she died, my father sent me to Shrewsbury School, where I was taught little more than Latin and Greek and some ancient history. I had no exceptional ability. My real interest lay outside of school, where I enjoyed hunting and natural history. I loved to explore. I spent many hours collecting animals and plants, then studying them in the laboratory that Ras improvised in the tool shed at the bottom of the garden. I was an avid collector of coins and shells, birds' eggs, rocks, and insects. Curious as neither Ras nor any of my 4 sisters had this passion for collecting or interest in nature. Here, look. These are some of the beetles I collected as a boy. Beetling was one of my greatest passions. Even as a student at Cambridge, I loved beetle hunting. One day, while removing the bark from a dead tree, I saw 2 rare beetles and seized one in each hand. Then I saw a 3rd specimen. Unwilling to give up any, I took one from my hand and popped it into my mouth in order to grab the 3rd. The beetle in my mouth emitted a vile and bitter fluid, and I was forced to spit it out, and as it ran away, the beetle in my other hand escaped. While that venture proved unsuccessful and untasteful, I later caught another beetle that proved to be a new species unknown to science, and I received credit from a scientific journal for capturing the first known specimen. When I became 16, my father sent me to Edinburgh to study medicine. I was a capable student, but found the lectures dull. As my interest in medical study waned, my interest in natural history intensified. When I left Edinburgh after 2 years, I made my first trip to London and found it a horridly smoky place. Then my uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, Uncle Jos, took me and my cousins Emma and Fanny to Paris. Upon my return, my father informed me of his new plans for my life in the Church of England. I found his decision most puzzling. My father had never showed any interest in religion. I cannot remember him ever attending church. But I never openly challenged him, and so enrolled at Christ's College, Cambridge, to study theology. My 3 years at Cambridge were amongst the happiest of my life. But when I left, I was most uncertain of my future. I continued my studies in natural history and geology and gave little thought to a future life as a country parson. What's that? No, I had no prejudice towards theology, but I had no passion for it. During my last year at Cambridge, I read Humboldt's personal narrative, a recounting of his geological explorations of South America. The book had stirred in me a burning desire to add to the knowledge of natural science. And then, a most amazing circumstance occurred, an opportunity that changed the course of my life. While at Cambridge, I became friends with John Henslow, professor of botany. He often invited me to his home for dinner. We took long walks together. Being with Henslow, I now imagined a vocation in the natural sciences consistent with my true interests. 10 years earlier, in 1820, the British Admiralty had launched a frigate, the HMS Beagle, exclusively designed for scientific research. And she was being prepared for a 3-year expedition to complete a survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. Henslow had recommended me for a position on the survey vessel in the role of gentleman's companion to the young captain, Captain Fitzroy, only 3 years my senior. Fitzroy proposed to give up part of his cabin to a young man willing to sail with him and to serve as naturalist without pay. During our interview, he emphasized that if I were to live with him, I must do so simply, no wine and plain meals. I considered this arrangement acceptable. My excitement was intense, but my father demurred, believing the voyage would be a total waste of time and injurious to my character as a clergyman. Fortunately, Uncle Jos persuaded him to change his mind, and after a delay of 2 months, the Beagle sailed from Plymouth on December 27, 1831. I was 23 years old. the beginning of my new life. We circumnavigated the world, spending most of our time, nearly 3.5 years of the 5-year voyage, exploring the southern extremity of South America. We landed in Brazil in February 1832. The memories of the sights and sounds of the Brazilian forest still create wondrous images in my mind. Can you imagine the excitement I felt walking in the jungle for the first time? I felt newly reborn. My mind was a chaos of delight. In one day, I collected 68 different kinds of beetles. I saw the march of army ants, frogs that could rest on the underside of leaves, and trees with trunks of colossal proportion. Everything was new to me. The beauty of the flowers, the green lushness of the foliage, the calls of parrots and strange insects, exotic odors, and forests of immense trees like great green living cathedrals, draped with parasitical plants, ferns, bromeliads, and orchids. When we landed on the Galapagos, we planned only a short visit to gather fresh water and provision. But we remained for over a month. Little did I realize then that my month on that isolated archipelago of 10 islands with their black lava rock and unique inhabitants would have such a profound effect on my thinking. It was a most momentous phase of the journey, for it was on the Galapagos that my mind was set afire, contemplating the origin of new life forms. Chapter 17 of my Voyage of the Beagle is a recounting of my Galapagos observations. I spent several nights sleeping on shore, surveying a carpet of stars from above my sleeping spot, the better able to rise early and observe the giant tortoises for which the islands are named. Seeing these huge land reptiles, I began to think about their origins. Where had they come from? For these were oceanic islands of volcanic origin, born from beneath the sea and devoid of any life initially. And why did each island harbor a tortoise variety of unique shape of shell?
The natural history of these islands is eminently curious and well deserves attention. Most of the species seem to represent aboriginal creations found nowhere else. There is even a difference between the inhabitants of the different islands, yet all show a marked relationship with those of the mainland, though separated from that continent by an open space of ocean about 600 miles in width. The archipelago seems a little world within itself. Here, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth. The birds of the islands quickly caught my attention. I obtained specimens of 26 different kinds. Of these, most interesting to me were a group of finches, related to each other, yet existing as 13 distinct species. In each species, the beak was of a unique size and shape, as if modified for some specific purpose of feeding. This observation set my brain to spinning. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. How I wish I had the time and strength to return to those enchanted islands. Hopefully, man will recognize the unique nature and location of the Galapagos and preserve and protect them for others to see and enjoy. They might well prove to be living laboratories for the study of the role of natural selection. We left the Galapagos and after a year returned to England. I took a coach without delay and made the 250-mile trip to Shrewsbury. When my father first saw me, he turned to my sisters and exclaimed, "Why, even the shape of his head is quite altered." I took this as a compliment, considering that my father once told me I cared for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and would be a disgrace to himself and all the family. After 3 months, I moved to London. Once settled, I began to review my journal notes and to put my thoughts to paper in different notebooks. My ideas remained scattered, without the nucleus of centralized form. Then, one evening, I put aside my scientific books and picked up to read for pleasure an essay on the principle of population by the Reverend Thomas Malthus. The book caused my thoughts to solidify. Malthus noted that populations of living organisms increase geometrically until checked by famine or disease. Consider a tapeworm, which produces 60 million eggs each year. Only a few of these could possibly survive, else the world would soon be overrun with tapeworms. And so too for beetles or buttercups. It occurred to me that in a world where living organisms produce more offspring than usually survive, and given that individuals vary one from the other,
then those with the heritable attributes best suited to the local conditions will be the ones most likely to endure. Some will live and some will die. And a process of selection would occur through perfectly natural means. Limited food supply, agents of disease to which some are sensitive and others more immune. I thought back to all I had witnessed on my voyage and to breeding experiments by means of which humans have produced a nearly endless variety of type by artificial means. If man can produce pigeons that tumble, chickens resembling dust mops, and dogs shaped like sausages, all by artificial selection and in short periods of time, what creations could nature conceive over millennia? And so I began to document evidence to support my theory of natural selection.
As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected.
At this time, I began to feel lonely, and I contemplated marriage. I wrote down the gains and losses to be incurred by such a decision on a piece of paper, which I kept. It amuses me to think of it now.
A note to myself, Great Marlborough Street, London, July 1838. To marry or not to marry? This is the question. Benefits of marriage. Children, if it please God. Constant companionship and friend in old age. Someone who will feel interested in me. An object to be beloved and played with. Better than a dog, anyhow. Home and someone to take care of the house. Charms of music and female chit-chat. These things good for one's health, but a terrible loss of time. How intolerable to think of spending all my life working and working. No, it won't do. Now imagine living all one day solitarily in a smoky, dirty London house. Now picture a nice, soft wife on a sofa with good books and music. Reasons not to marry. Have the freedom to go where I like, and the choice of society, the conversation of clever men at clubs, not forced to visit relatives and to bend in every trifle, or to have the expense and anxiety of children, quarreling, loss of time, cannot read in the evenings, fatness, idleness, anxiety, responsibility, less money for my books if there are many children. When I finished, my longer list of benefits persuaded me to pursue the adventurous unknowns of matrimony. And so, in 1838, I became engaged to my cousin, Emma Wedgwood. We were soon married. We moved into a new London house, and I began work on my book on coral atoll formation. Em is deeply religious and has fretted about my lack of faith. The Wedgwoods have two notable attributes: their pottery and their piety. When we were first married, we often attended church together, but I no longer go. But I am happy to say, in spite of our differences, it has created no friction in our lives together. Within the year, we had our first child, William. How I delighted in his expressions. I peered into his crib and made odd noises and strange faces, and recorded all my observations in a notebook. I later compared these to those of Jenny, the orangutan in the London Zoo. You see, I was convinced that at this early period, human expressions, like those of other animals, have a gradual and natural origin. Soon after William's birth, Em and I desired to leave the vile conditions of London and find a place in the country. I longed to live where I could hear the birds singing and the wind in the trees. We searched for nearly 2 years and finally settled on this house and acreage here in Kent. My father generously gave us the purchase cost, and Em, William, and I, and our new daughter, Annie, left London. I quickly became attached to this house. We called it Down House, although Rass, who detested the country, said we should call it Down in the Mouth House. I made some changes to the house and the garden, and I created my sand walk, a wooded area encircled by a sandy path. You saw it from the hallway when you came in. I planted all those hollies and hawthorns. It is my favorite walking place, my thinking path. We have been married for 43 years. Em
has borne me 10 children and has been a loving and caring wife and mother. Our last child, Charles, was born in 1858, and M delivered him without pain under chloroform. I administered it to her myself. The use of chloroform then was not without controversy. Critics of its use said it was unnatural and against the teachings of the Bible. However, I welcomed the possibility of birth without pain. And in other medical matters, when it became necessary that some of my teeth be extracted, I took chloroform and hardly felt anything. I say, let those who argue for biblical authority in medical and scientific matters have their teeth pulled and their babies delivered without anesthesia. But let it be available for those of us of differing persuasion. What's that? Oh, I digress. My scientific work. Well, I would say my ideas about natural selection were largely formed by 1838, shortly before Em and I were married. In 1842, I wrote a 35-page abstract of my theory in pencil. And in 1844, I expanded this to a paper of 230 pages in ink. When I finished, I wrote a letter to M to be opened in the event of my death. In it, as a last request, I urged her to publish my theory. But then I largely rested the matter and did not continue working on the big book that lay at the back of my mind. In 1848, my father died, but I was too ill to attend his funeral. I had barely recovered when our daughter Annie, then 10 years old, became very sick, and I went with her to Dr. Gully's hydropathy establishment at Malvern. At this time, at my father's advice, I was trying hydropathy as a treatment for my skin rashes and other ailments. In spite of all Dr. Gully's attentions, we watched as Annie became weaker and weaker over several weeks' time. In spite of all we tried, she died at Easter time. I thought I would never stop crying. It was a wound that never healed. The development of my disbelief in religious doctrine was a gradual thing. But with the death of Annie, it became complete. With the exception of a family christening and the recent funeral of Rass, I never attended church again. I remember our times together on the sandwalk, how she would go on ahead pirouetting in front of me, warning me of caterpillars on the path, lest I step on them. On the way back to the house, we would stop by the large lime tree and sit and listen to the birds as she fussed with my hair and collar and cuffs to make me beautiful. Then we would begin walking again, and she would run on ahead, laughing, her every movement full of life and vigor, and hide in the shrubbery by M's garden. When I think of Annie, as I sometimes do late at night when I cannot sleep, I am reminded of the poem Elegy by Thomas Gray, one of my favorite poets. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. In September of 1854, I had wooden lofts built beside the house, and I began to breed pigeons. And after 8 years of work, I finally finished my Barnacle monographs, describing more species of barnacles than I had ever dreamed existed. The beloved barnacles early in the project became the everlasting barnacles at the end, and my friends accused me of having barnacles on the brain. Now, finally, I had the time to work on my big book. My closest friend and confidant, the botanist Joseph Hooker, urged me to publish, and so I set to the task. But then, in June of 1858, a most unforeseen event occurred. I received a package in the mail from Indonesia. Inside was a manuscript by a young biologist, Alfred Wallace. Mr. Wallace informed me that he respected my opinion and asked my advice of his ideas. I read his paper in near disbelief. In his short essay entitled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type," he described a theory of natural selection nearly identical to my own. His short essay was an abstract of my big book. The terms he used could easily have stood for my chapter headings. As an honorable man, I felt obliged to forward his paper on to the proper authorities so that he would receive the recognition due him. I was at a loss for what to do and turned to my friends Hooker and Lyell for advice. It was they who recommended that my unpublished paper, written in 1844, and Wallace's paper be publicly read together at the next meeting of the London Linnaean Society. The reading caused little stir. But now I felt a sense of great urgency. I worked on my book at every opportunity during a time of hardship and ill health. An epidemic of scarlet fever broke out in Down Village, and we lost our little Charles. I lost entire days through terrible fits of vomiting and could barely write for more than 20 minutes at a time without stomach pain. In September 1859, I corrected the final page proofs of the book, and in November, The Origin of Species was finally published. It is the chief work of my life. Soon, I received a multitude of letters. I received wonderful letters of support from Hooker, the American botanist Asa Gray, and the zoologist Thomas Huxley, who was to become one of my most loyal friends and most active supporters. Huxley warned me of the considerable abuse and misrepresentation bound to come my way. His premonitions came to pass. I received hateful and fearful letters. Some called me the most dangerous man in Europe. I was vilified by the press and from pulpits throughout the country. Two of the most bitter reviews of my book were written by two of my oldest friends, the geologist Adam Sedgwick and the anatomist Richard Owen. I received most of the credit and the criticism. But the ideas were not mine alone, of course. In addition to Wallace, there was my grandfather, Erasmus, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and the great French naturalist, Buffon. Indeed, Samuel Butler wrote, Buffon planted, Erasmus Darwin and Lamarck watered. But it was Mr. Darwin who said, the fruit is ripe, and shook it into our laps. Have you read my book? Has anyone here read my book? Thank you, sir. If you read my book, you will note that I do not use the term evolution, but speak instead of descent with modification. This was deliberate on my part, for the term evolution had been used by others earlier, and in the vernacular of the time was firmly tied to a concept of progress. To my way of thinking, this was a fallacious idea. Species may change over time, and new species appear as they diverge from common ancestral stock and adapt to life's ever-changing conditions. But they do not progress towards some more improved or superior form, or accede to some state of greater nobility or perfection. There is as much to marvel and delight in as a sessile barnacle, a legless lizard, a blind cavefish, or a primate that stands erect and contemplates the stars. In June of 1860, the origin was publicly debated at the British Association meeting at Oxford. I was too ill to attend. It is providential that I was absent, given the nature of the attacks on me and my ideas by Richard Owen, Fitzroy, and the Bishop, Samuel Wilberforce. I don't think I could have borne to confront the bishop, or the sight of Fitzroy holding his Bible aloft and yelling, "The book, the book." Sadly, years later, Fitzroy was dead by his own hand. What a mixed character of a man. Saddened as I was by the attacks against me, I was immensely cheered when I heard the news that Hooker and Huxley had so ably defended my views at the debate. What a scene it was. The meeting room was packed to suffocation with 700 people. On the platform sat my good friend, Professor Henslow, who chaired the meeting. The clergy, who shouted lustily for Wilberforce, were in the middle of the room, and behind them a cluster of undergraduates. After several opening speakers, the moment of expected confrontation occurred. Much has been made of that meeting and of what was actually spoken at its conclusion by Wilberforce and my champion Huxley. Wilberforce was the first to speak. He ridiculed my work, and in conclusion, he turned to face Huxley. "And so to you, my dear Huxley, about to tear me apart once I have sat down, I put to you the question, is it through your grandfather or your grandmother that you claim descent from a monkey?" Huxley rose to the challenge. He defended all of my work and the enterprise of scientific inquiry. And when he finished, he turned to address the bishop.
"Finally, good sir, in regard to your question of my ancestry, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather or a man, highly endowed by nature and possessed of great means and influence, for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into grave scientific discussion? Why then, sir, I would unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape. I should feel no shame in a primate origin, For I, sir, would rather be the offspring of 2 apes than to be a man, eloquent in the service of prejudice and falsehood, and who is afraid to face the truth.
I found the bishop generally free of malice. But as for Huxley, well, his dislike of the man lasted until years later, when sadly Wilberforce was thrown from his horse and his head struck a stone. Upon hearing the news, Huxley wrote,
"For once, the bishop's brains and reality came into contact, and the result was fatal."
The only mention of humans that I made in my book was the single sentence, "Much light will be thrown on man and his origins." But in my later books, The Descent of Man and the Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, I saw no need to be coy or to avoid the obvious. We are animals also. We, too, are a product of natural selection. Although we behave as if we are separate and apart from all else, we are not immune from natural law. Em told me she thought my later books would be more interesting. But she feared greater controversy. She was right. The Morning Post and other publications which had accepted the origin, although with reservation, angrily attacked The Descent of Man. The Times took 2 editions and 6 whole columns to condemn the book. Of late, my overall health has somewhat improved. Some say my problem is psychological and accuse me of being a hypochondriac, as if I should wish upon myself the tonics and emetics, the bismuth, the magnesia, the nitromuriatic acid, the Fowler's solution, and all the other medications I have been forced to endure. Perhaps I contracted some infectious agent in the jungles of Brazil, or when I was bitten by the great black benchuca bug in Chile. I fear the true nature of my malady shall always remain a mystery. There is much less troubling me now. The income from my property, investments, and books has steadily increased. All 5 of my sons have successful careers, although 3 are in poor health. George is a professor of astronomy at Cambridge, and Francis is a botanist at Cambridge. He has become my secretary and assists me in my botanical studies. During the last year, I have taken nearly an hour every afternoon to record my autobiographical recollections, for my children and grandchildren. And I have recently seen the publication of my final 2 books. Indeed, my last book, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, was published this week, and I just received my copy. Strange that my last book should be on worms, but then again, not so strange. In our arrogance, we consider ourselves separate and supreme, preoccupied with thoughts of heaven from our pedestals. We are often oblivious to what lies just beneath our feet. The worms were here long before we appeared, and will be here long after we are gone. The nature of the scientific mind is most curious. You see, soon after I returned from my voyage, I visited Uncle Jos to see M. While there, I noticed that a layer of lime applied by gardeners 10 years earlier now lay under 2.5 inches of soil. When we first moved to Down House, I scattered a layer of chalk in M's garden, and I observed that over the years it too gradually disappeared, finally becoming located 7 inches below the surface after 29 years. Now, either chalk or lime deposited on open ground sinks at the rate of about 1/4 inch per year, or a layer of vegetable mold of that same thickness is deposited annually on the surface by the actions of some unknown agency. Well, I soon discovered that it was earthworms passing through and turning the soil, eating and excreting vegetable matter that were the agents responsible for the deposits. And Francis and I calculated that the earthworms at Down House annually carry some 18 tons of soil per acre to the surface. How I have enjoyed the adventure of science and of satisfying the questions that always seem to fill my head. When I am obliged to give up observation and experiment, last month, Em and I holidayed at Lake Ullswater in Patterdale. While walking, I began to feel very dizzy and to have chest pains. I can no longer walk as I once did, and have become depressed with thoughts of dying. Not with death, mind you. It's but a voyage of another kind, after all. but with the thought of all that I must leave behind. Strange. I once thought of becoming a clergyman, but I became an agnostic instead. Critics say my work is an attack on Christianity, an attempt to deny God. But what kind of deity, I ask myself, would create a creature of complex brain and then be offended when it were used? But I have no interest in futile debates of apes or angels. If there is any consistent enemy of religion, it is not science, but intolerance and irrationalism. Should we appreciate a butterfly any less because its beauty is unplanned? Even though there may be no designer, can we not stand in awe of a natural process that creates the near perfect illusion of design? When I think of those who have cursed me or ridiculed my views, I am comforted by the realization that I have worked as hard and as well as I could. Nothing is more intolerable than idleness, and I have tried to accomplish as much as I could in the time allotted to me. I have sought answers to help explain this wonderful natural world that I have come to know and love. And this is the conclusion I have come to. Indeed, it is the way I concluded my book, The Origin of Species. Probably all organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed. There is a grandeur in this view of life, that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Now, you must excuse me. I am feeling very tired and need to rest. But I do thank you for coming and for your patience, sitting and listening as I related aspects of my life, one of adventure and never-ending discovery. May yours be likewise. Good night.
So I'd be happy to entertain any questions at this time if you have any. Yes, sir.
Are you speaking as a sort of former Air Force, Mr. Darwin?
I don't presume to know Darwin well enough to speak as if I were in the persona of Darwin. I'd rather speak as myself. I know a little bit about Darwin. I do not consider myself a Darwin scholar. The man was a complex human being. So I'd be happy to answer questions from my perspective.
From your perspective, was there any time in Darwin's life when he had an epiphany or a aha moment or something, or did this kind of, it seems to me it was more gradual in his cases. Really.
Yes, he mentions that in his autobiography. Much of this, as I mentioned in the program, is taken from his own autobiography. I took very little poetic license here. Many of the words are his own words. So yes, he mentions that his disillusionment with formal religion, religious doctrine, was a slow, gradual process.
Well, what about the natural selection? That idea, it seems to me that grew slowly within rather than suddenly. The Einstein, for instance.
Oh no, he pretty much had the theory, the rough draft, if you will, back in 1838. Again, he mentions this in his autobiography. And then, of course, he writes his short essay in pencil, tentatively. Darwin was a great scientist in my estimation, because if you read his letters and his manuscripts and whatever, he's never quite absolutely sure. He's fairly sure he's come up with the idea, but he's always looking for more evidence, more facts, etc.
Why did he call the origin an abstract? I was quite struck when I saw that in the introduction, he said this abstract, and there's several hundred pages that follow. Those are larger than the abstracts I usually see.
Okay, I'm going to pass on that question, and Patricia here, I guess, who teaches history of science here at Case, may want to answer that.
Yeah, Darwin was working on a much longer book for a very long time, like 20 years, and because of Wallace's letter, was pushed into writing it into one book, and so that 400-page book is an abstract of what would have been a much, much longer book, which probably would not have been read by as many people as the shorter one. So that's why it's an abstract. The first chapter, The Origin, was expanded into a 2-volume work on the domestication, on the variation of domestication.
Yes, ma'am.
What do you know of the descendants of Darwin?
The descendants of Darwin,
And what they may have accomplished or
of his 7 surviving children, 2 of them had children, and they were small families. The Darwins were not very fertile. I can't speak of all the present-day living descendants. There are several, and several of them have written some wonderful books. One is a beautiful book called Annie's Box, which looks at the Darwin family from the perspective of Annie, this daughter that died, who at her death they discovered a little box where she had kept her various mementos and treasures. So the book is written from that perspective, and that's written by a guy called Randall Keats, who was one of Darwin's descendants. But of his 7 surviving children, only 2 had children themselves. Yes.
Emeritus' first cousin, the children were very healthy.
Yes. Darwin fretted about that.
Was he aware of the perils of differing for one another politically at that time, or was he conscious of the fact that it maybe wasn't a good idea?
I don't think, well, people at that time didn't have a real good understanding of genetics. Mendel was Darwin's contemporary, and nobody knew what Mendel was doing. Nobody understood what he was doing, and Darwin certainly had never seen Mendel's paper. So they didn't really have a good understanding. And in the Darwin family, there were a number of first cousin marriages between the Darwins and the Wedgwoods. But again, Darwin mentions in his autobiography that perhaps marrying his first cousin may have contributed to the sickliness of many of his children, and he felt somewhat, he was bothered by that. Yes.
What's your acting background? Do you have one?
Well, sort of. When I was much younger, I had a big decision to make because I was very interested in the sciences and I was very interested in the arts. And my fantasy was to become an opera singer. And I did quite a bit of theater throughout high school and college. And when I saw I was about to retire from college teaching, there are a number of things I don't miss about academia, but I do miss being able to work with students. I have a great feeling that teaching is a noble profession. So I missed the teaching. So I thought, okay, they're about to send me off to pasture. I'm still doing research. I'm still doing lots of different things. So I thought, well, perhaps when I wrote this play 8 years ago, I had in mind the notion of continuing to educate in the entertaining medium of theater. So, yes, I have some background in theater. Yes, sir.
I think perhaps one of the more lesser-known sides of Darwin is abolitionist views. And I'm wondering if you could give us any insight on the views of abolitionists, how that may have played into the views on evolution and natural selection.
Oh, I'm not sure if I can answer that part of it, but you're absolutely correct. He came from a family that was very socially conscious. Both his grandfather and his father were very active in the anti-slavery movement. His grandfather, a really brilliant intellectual, had actually formed a society, the Lunatic Society. They met once a month on the night of a full moon, and they were very active in social causes, social justice issues. We also know that Fitzroy was very pro-slavery, and during their 5 years on the Beagle, they often had discussions about such things, social issues, including slavery and religion. And at times we know that Fitzroy got extremely angry with Darwin and told him to leave the cabin and never return, this kind of thing. So, but we don't actually know very well what they actually talked about. Fitzroy doesn't really talk very much in his journals about the conversations they had. And Darwin, in spite of the fact that Fitzroy turns against him and is calling him all sorts of nasty things at the end, Darwin never says a nasty thing about Fitzroy. Always respects the man for the opportunity he had and the privilege he had of going and so on. I can't answer your question, though. To what degree Darwin's abolitionist views played into, maybe somebody else can answer that question.
There is a new book out this week on just that topic by Desmond Ismore, the authors of the biography of One.
Okay.
You go on Amazon and write your comment.
What is the name of the book? Do you know? Okay, so there is a... Okay, look for the book, sir. There, maybe your answer. Oh, okay. Yes.
I wonder, the Darwin had any doubts about his later in life. I know that Lord Kelvin had come out as, being absolutely sure that the Earth was much younger than it would be required to be growing because it was too warm, and they hadn't discovered radioactivity, so the fear was that the Earth is too young to interact 4 billion years ago, and how would they have the surge and everything to him?
Well, here at Case, you have this district library. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And I was up there yesterday looking at the original Darwin letters that you have here. Wonderful collection. If those of you who are interested should try and go up and look at some of that material. Lots of the first editions of Darwin's books. But I noticed yesterday as I was looking, one of the letters written shortly before his death, can't remember the exact date, he says, "I'm pretty sure I've come up with the correct explanation." But yeah, he was the consummate scientist. He was always questioning whether or not he had everything right? Whether he had enough facts to support his view. And that, of course, is the nature of science. You maintain an open mind, a tentative explanation, a willingness to change should new facts or evidence cause it to. Yeah. Pardon?
Did Darwin correspond?
Yes, they did. I'm not sure if there are any letters. Just a few. In your collection, apparently you have a few. I just came from Santa Barbara. I gave a performance there, and I went to a museum called the David Karpelis Museum, the largest collection of manuscripts, rare manuscripts in the United States. I'd never heard about this guy. He's a true philanthropist. He's got 9 museums all over the country. He has a huge Darwin collection, including many of the letters Darwin wrote to Wallace, many of the letters that Wallace wrote to Darwin. So yes, they corresponded for many years. And of course, Wallace is very kind toward Darwin. Wallace becomes a footnote in many of the science books, even though he came up with the idea. Darwin, was there 20 years or so earlier. And Wallace is very understanding and is quite willing to give Darwin all the credit. He's a very humble man. Well, both men were extremely humble. Yes, sir.
Another thought went to your set. How did you come to design the set?
Well, the set, I tell the sponsoring agency, in this case, Case and the museum here, what props, what furniture I need, and then what props I would like. And then I bring a few props with me, the photographs and a few other things, but most of this was supplied by the Cleveland Natural History Museum. So I generally, try to make things as they might have been. I've been to Darwin's study 3 times. His study is filled with shells and skulls and all sorts of stuff.
There's no edge with it,
No, there's no wedge with pottery. Yes?
I did wish to bring up the idea of social Darwinism, which probably shouldn't be called Darwinism because it wasn't an idea of Darwin. Rather, it was first invented by Herbert Spencer.
Yes.
And also, even the phrase, the survival of the fittest was not Darwin, rather it was coined by Spencer. Even though the ideas of Spencer very often are mistakenly attributed to Darwin. And then they were later on adopted by, if I'm not mistaken, by Rockefeller and some others that basically followed those kinds of principles of survival of the fittest as in their opinion, it would apply to human society.
So was there a question in there?
I was wondering if you could comment on that, or, well, yes, there was a question in there about whether,
Well, we all know that social Darwinism was an application of Darwinian principles, the idea of selection, to complex social issues. And,
yes, but Darwin and Spencer were pretty much contemporaries. So, but to your knowledge, was at all ever Darwin influenced by Spencer, or was it that just Spencer took up his idea that, and made some changes without saying that, they were rather entirely so and not Darwin?
Would you like to answer that, Pat?
We can go on for a while. I think that Darwin was very little influenced by Spencer, although some of Spencer's writings actually predate the origin. But I think the important thing to remember is that genetics was not well developed. Heredity was not well understood. And so to the extent that there's any Darwinism at all in social Darwinism, it was a misapplication of it because the assumption was made that any variation must necessarily be hereditary. And in fact, lots of things in agriculture are not hereditary at all. If you follow, family lines, you tend to get people of the same religion in family lines, Democrats and Republicans in family lines. But this is not genetic variation, and so it's not going to be subject to the sort of Darwinian processes that Darwin was talking about.
I just want to say before you all leave, I don't believe in captive audiences. So if you don't worry about being impolite and getting up if you have to go somewhere, but many of you may not have read The Origin of Species, and I didn't see too many hands go up, although maybe you were shy.
Personally, I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure if we were actually.
That's okay. If you're at all interested in anything that happened here, go ahead and read a little Darwin or read something about Darwin. I encourage you perhaps to consider his Voyage of the Beagle, where you actually see the young Darwin describing the things that he's seeing on this wonderful voyage. Or read his autobiography, which I think is a very fascinating read. Those two. And then there are lots of really good books written about Darwin. I just saw one, it just was published, called Charles and Emma. And it looks at the relationship between these two very loving people, one extremely religious, one who had eventually turned away from religion, and yet they had these very strong bonds. Emma was a wonderful supporter of everything Darwin did. She read many of his manuscripts. The first draft, she makes often interesting little comments in the margins. I've seen the book, and it's beautifully written, so that might be one you might want to look at if you found anything here relative about Darwin and his family situation, because he was not only a wonderful scientist, he was a fine and decent human being. And one of the reasons I do this is I get so tired of hearing the creationists and the anti-science people talking about the devil Darwin and this and that, because they generally don't know what they're talking about in general, either about science or about Darwin, but that doesn't stop them. But he was a fine and decent human being. Yeah.
I'm really interested in the debate between Thomas Huxley and Bishop, I forget his name.
Bishop Wilberforce.
Is
So be saying.
Is that
Yes.
Is that debate available in a transcript or
No.
book form or anything?
The debate, the words of the debate are lost to time. The only really good record we have of anything that happened in that debate was Huxley's memoirs. And you can read books by Huxley, and he has written down what he, as best he can remember, said. But there was no verbatim transcripts. There was no one there recording this wonderful debate. And the words of Wilberforce are largely lost to time. And when I performed this play here 3 years ago, I think it was, I don't know if anybody has come back. Hey, wonderful. I tried to recreate the drama of that debate, and I'd go behind a screen and come out with a Huxley face mask and a Wilberforce. It got to be too complicated. But that was a wonderful debate, and to know anything about what actually happened, you have to read some of Huxley's works. Yes?
Well, I know that Darwin really liked dogs. And I was wondering if
Darwin really liked what?
dogs.
Dogs. Oh yes, he had a... When I wrote the play, I was actually thinking about bringing a dog on stage. He had several dogs that would follow him on his walks. And these dogs, I'm sorry, maybe you were going to ask a question. So let me have your question first.
So did his theory of evolution influence any of his feelings about the human
Yes, but I can't give you... Patricia, would you like to answer that question?
Emma was very strongly anti-vivisectionist, and Darwin also. They gave money to anti-vivisection leagues and were interested in animal welfare generally. And it was both personal fondness, as I elaborate on, but also a feeling of connectedness, right? If we're relatives, blood relatives through evolution, then the assumption is that animals feel pain in very much the same way as
Well, he had several dogs, and if you are a dog lover or you have a dog, his Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals is a wonderful book to read, because that book ushered in the whole field of comparative psychology. And he has lots of really neat stuff in there. And a lot of it comes from his own experiences with his dogs. One of his dogs, Polly, little terrier, was a faithful companion to Darwin, and she picked up, and this is what led him, of course, to all this evidence in the book, on all little cues, body language that he had. She'd pick up on that, and she'd know exactly when he was going to go on his walk. She'd get very excited when she sensed he was getting ready to go on his walk. I'm going to take just one or two more questions, because I understand this museum closes. I think this museum has closed. It closes at 5, I'm told. But anyway, I hope you can all get out. Yeah.
What seems to be probably difficult for him to be such a humble person, but knowingly putting out such a contradictory or a difficult concept for people to. How was he in public? And did he ever defend his position?
No.
Did he ever try to promote
No,
self-promotion?
he led an extremely reclusive life. He never ever went out in public to defend his work. He left that to Hooker and Huxley and his other supporters. And some would say he was afraid. But one of the arguments is that the cause of his illness was just in his head, psychosomatic. It was his excuse not to go out into public to defend. The man was truly ill. His illness was organic in nature, but he just didn't care. That was not important to him. What was important to him was the adventure of scientific inquiry. But he did not go out into public to defend his work. Okay, well, thank you very much.